Boldwood presents Bring Me Sunshine, written by Alex Brown and read by Mira Dovreni. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Queen-ager. Noun. Queen, ager. A woman with experience who still knows how to have fun. Prologue. Kalosiros, Greece, 1990. Sinking her toes into the sand, she savoured the soft sensation as the plump peach sun streaked the sky amber, bathing the sea with its shaft of shimmering gold. Leaning into him, she rested her head on his shoulder as they sat together on a large rock at the water's edge, listening to the waves tumbling over the sand. The holiday was almost over. 2 blissful weeks of snorkelling, sketching the gorgeous Greek island sights, shell collecting, horse riding on wet sand at low tide, and hanging out together drinking cans of Fanta orange and eating homemade hummus with warm pita bread. Before they'd each go back to their respective lives, him in Athens and her in London. She touched a finger to the beaded friendship bracelets they had exchanged and smiled as she remembered the piece of paper tucked inside the pocket of her jean shorts. His address. Even though she already knew where his grandparents' whitewashed sugar cube house was, where he stayed in the summer near his family's beach taverna, this was different. He had given her the piece of paper with his Athens address on, which meant things had changed between them now. This was the start of something special, a proper romance. She just knew it. She would put his address in her diary for safekeeping, and as soon as she got back home to England, she could write to him and cross off the days until they could be together again next summer. Her lips still tingled from the touch of his mouth on hers. Her first real kiss, and her heart had fizzed, sending butterflies swirling around inside her. She felt on top of the world. Back home, she kept a Jackie Collins library book in her school bag to read in the privacy of her bedroom, and now she finally understood how lucky Sant'Angelo felt when she was in love. As the sun melted away, turning the night sky into a canopy of twinkling stars, she curled her fingers around his before tracing a heart on the back of his hand, whispering the first line from their song, "Bring me sunshine." The swirling sensation soared inside her again as she moved her head and he turned to face her, singing softly, "In your smile." As he rested his forehead on hers, the sweet tang of Fanta still there on his lips as they kissed again, making her wish she could stay in this moment forever. Chapter 1. Tinderdale, rural England, present day. In the hall of the grand gated residence, on a hilltop overlooking undulating fields full of sheep where she was working, Gina hummed happily to herself as she packed her cleaning products into the laundry basket that she used to transport them from her clients' houses to the boot of her car. Checking that nothing had been left behind, she hitched the basket onto her left hip and pulled the heavy front door closed before making the trek all the way down the steep, million-mile-long driveway, or so it seemed, to the lane where she now had to park. Mr. and Mrs. Horton-Jones were very particular about the honey-coloured stone brickwork on their driveway, and since that time last month when Gina's clapped-out old Clio had leaked sticky black oil all over the place, they had asked her to park on the grassy verge by the side of the road. She had apologised profusely at the time, of course, willing her face to stop flaming and inwardly cursing her top lip for choosing to flick on the sweat sprinkler at the worst possible moment. As she and Mrs. Horton-Jones watched the oil slick become a rivulet of rainbow-coloured liquid when the rain started. The oil had snaked and smeared all over the driveway, pooling at the toes of Gina's canvas slip-on trainers that had definitely seen better days. She wished she had been able to run away from her shame, but it had been impossible, as she still needed the money from this cleaning job to go towards the last instalment due on her holiday, a whole 2 weeks away on the Greek island of Kalosiros. Gina had been dreaming and cleaning and humming songs to herself for years as she thought about going back to the idyllic Greek island full of happy childhood holiday memories there with her single-parent mum, Shirley. She fondly remembered the cylindrical windmills and winding white cobbled lanes and rock-lined beaches, the rays from the hot Mediterranean sun dazzling on the crystalline azure waves. Especially the summer she had turned 15 and shared her first kiss, then more kisses in the summers after too, with Nico, the boy from the beach taverna. The holidays had stopped when Shirley became ill, and then, when she died, those good times had faded to a distant memory. Gina had met her husband Colin soon after, but all these years later, she found herself wondering if Nico still lived on the tiny island, and if he remembered her, because she'd never forgotten about him. Not that this was her reason for wanting to go back to Kalosiros. It was more that she had never forgotten the happy, carefree feeling of her youth, or the romance and sense of escape she felt when she was there, and that she dreamed of recapturing once more. Then, after seeing her absolute favourite film, Mamma Mia, a few years ago, having missed it the first time around, Gina had started working as a cleaner and had been saving up ever since. She had visions of frolicking across the moonlit beach in a floaty caftan with a warm wind in her hair and the rousing strum of ABBA's Fernando playing somewhere in the background. And to be honest, it was the thought of doing this that had kept her going throughout all those times she'd snapped on her sunshine yellow marigolds, ready to get elbow deep in scrubbing somebody else's loo. Reaching the Clio, Gina stowed the basket in the boot and fished her phone out from the front pocket of her pink tabard to switch it back on. The phone made a tweeting bird sound immediately to signify the arrival of another message. She closed her eyes momentarily and let out a long, fortifying breath before looking at the screen. She knew the symphony of message alerts chirping one after the other would be from Colin, her husband of 27 years. He was the only person who insisted on sending her streams of messages when she was out working. His first message had chirped on her phone over 2 hours ago, just as she had arrived at Mr. and Mrs. Horton-Jones's house and was carefully putting the laundry basket down on the welcome home mat outside their front door. She'd had her index finger poised to press the doorbell that chimed like a herd of mountain goats with bells on their collars, knowing that Mrs. Horton-Jones would do that impatient, sighing smile thing if Gina was looking at her phone when the door opened, so she had swiftly switched it off and shoved it in her pocket. But there was no ignoring him now. Colin would only keep on, calling or badgering her with more messages, until she answered him. So, after listening to a partial voice message before it cut out, she tapped through all the messages to get the gist of what he was actually saying, her eyes homing in on the key words that made her scrolling index finger start to tremble in disbelief and disappointment. "Sorry, love. Can't be helped. Make it up to you. Never mind. Why don't you go with a mate or my mum instead?" Gina let it sink in, intending on counting to 10 first, but she only made it to 3 before a rage reared up inside her and she pressed call, willing herself to try to keep calm, but no matter how hard she tried, it felt impossible to suppress the feeling. It had been happening more and more for the best part of a year now. A horrible tension, a rage that seemed to descend on her from absolutely nowhere and often without reason. But right now, right here, there was a reason. And even if her frustration felt scarily disproportionate, it didn't change the fact that she didn't want to go on a romantic holiday of a lifetime with a mate. Not that she really had any mates. Certainly not one she was close enough with to go on holiday for 2 weeks. Yes, there were a few women she chatted to over at the allotment she tended to on a Saturday morning. But she had lost touch with her real best friends from school when she had started going out with Colin all those years ago. He always said that they were enough for each other and didn't need other friends. And it had felt sweet in the beginning, but not so much now. And her much older mother-in-law, Pam, who lived with her and Colin, hated everything foreign. Pam would refuse to even try a chicken ball from a Friday night Chinese takeaway, already convinced it won't agree with me, and then I'll have one of my turns and be up all night with heartburn. Gina was tired of hearing stuff like this all the time. It sucked the little bit of joy that she still felt from time to time right out of her life. She did love Pam in her own way, but there was no way she was about to test this love by spending 2 weeks with her, 24/7 in a foreign country. No, Gina had no desire to end up in a Greek jail, charged with throttling her own mother-in-law. "Are you on your way back now?" Colin said as a conversation opener, seemingly without a care in the world, and oblivious to having trampled all over his wife's long-held dream holiday plans that she had worked incredibly hard to save for. Gina pulled the phone away from her ear in an exaggerated fashion, like they do in slapstick movies, when words literally fail the person holding the phone. His nonchalance further stoking the bubbling furnace inside her. "No, Colin, I am not on my way back now." "But you're usually finished by now, and I've made you a cup of tea. My treat. Thought you could do with it after all that cleaning, love." She could actually hear the smile of satisfaction in his voice as he gave himself a proverbial pat on the back. A cup of tea. Give the man a medal. The beat of silence that followed was deafening, as Gina focused on the pumping sound of her own blood throbbing in her ears and turning her clarity of thought into a head full of cotton wool. "Is that all you have to say?" Gina quickly shook her head and took a big breath as she tried to garner some focus. She got in the car and closed the door, figuring it probably wasn't a good idea to lose her flaming temper within earshot of her employers. Mind you, if the holiday was off, then she wouldn't need to clean for them anymore in any case. Colin covered the household expenses, but wouldn't pay for extras, which was why she had got the cleaning job in the first place, so she could save up for their holiday. The disappointment was crushing, and for a moment she thought she might cry. Tears made her vision filmy as she pulled the seatbelt over her shoulder and clicked it into place, flipping her phone to hands-free and put it in the cradle on the dashboard. She turned the key in the ignition, and as if on autopilot, she prayed for the car to start the first time, as she always did. Nothing. Just the hollow sound of grinding metal, as if the car had finally decided to give up for good, much like Gina was feeling like doing in that moment. Catching a glimpse of herself in the rear-view mirror, Gina wondered when she got so tired-looking, weary and worn down, her grey roots in stark contrast to the box-dyed brown curls of the rest of her hair. She let out a long sigh, swiped the cuff of her sleeve across her cheeks to stem the tears, and sat back in the seat. She was in no fit state to drive home safely anyway, and to be honest, home was the last place she wanted to be right now. Not with Colin being all nonchalant about having let her down, no doubt, and Pam complaining about something or another. "I did say in one of my messages that I'll make it up to you, love. We could use the money you've saved to go to that caravan place you like for a long weekend." "Colin, please don't," she said quietly, seemingly now resigned to the fact they wouldn't be going on holiday after all. The chance of rekindling a romantic connection and revitalising her lacklustre marriage completely shattered. "Well, I'm only trying to help. What would you rather I do, lose my job? Because that's what will happen if I don't go on the away day," Colin piped up, and Gina's heart sank even further. She had heard enough. He just didn't get it. She wondered if he ever had. "If you really wanted to help, then surely you would have put our holiday plans before a team-building away day," she snapped. "Where did you say it was again?" That part of Colin's message had been full of crackling static, and so it had been impossible to hear what he had been saying. "Oh, somewhere near Slough, I think. I can get all the details for you if you don't believe me," he offered keenly. A little too keenly, it suddenly struck Gina. "You know, the hotel where we're all staying." Gina inhaled again, his vagueness making her uneasy. But she didn't have the energy to ask more right now. The top and bottom of it was that Colin had clearly never even booked the time off work, because surely if he had, then they wouldn't expect him to cancel a foreign holiday that had been well over 2 years in the planning to attend a team-building day somewhere near Slough. A sudden tapping on the window startled Gina, and she instinctively told Colin, "I've got to go," and ended the call. Mrs. Horton-Jones was standing at the door of the car, just what she needed. Gina gingerly cranked down the window. "Is everything all right, dear? Only you've been sitting here for quite some time now," Mrs. Horton-Jones said, fingering the heirloom gold locket on a chain at her neck, before folding her arms and rearranging her face into one of concern. Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was just about to leave. I just had a bit of trouble with starting the car, and then my husband called to tell me we can't go on the holiday I've been dreaming of forever, and—" Gina stopped talking, conscious that she was babbling and massively oversharing, and that Mrs. Horton-Jones now had her head tilted to one side in sympathy, the last thing she wanted. She could feel tears stinging in the corners of her eyes again. "Please don't feel sorry for me, please don't feel sorry for me." Gina said it over and over like a calming mantra inside her head, willing herself not to cry, as she always did when someone was being nice to her. "Oh, dear!" Mrs. Horton-Jones studied Gina for a few seconds, and then, to her horror, surprise, or utter disbelief, she wasn't sure which exactly, her employer swung open the car door and took Gina's hand off the steering wheel, holding it firmly and reassuringly in hers. "Come on now, let's get you a strong, sweet cup of tea and see if we can sort this out together. Harold can take a look at the car. Will you tell me about this holiday you can't go on?" Gina stumbled out of the car. "That's it, there you go." And she couldn't hold back the tears any longer as Mrs. Horton-Jones put her arm around her shoulders and chivied her back up the million-mile-long driveway towards the house. A few weeks later, and Gina was still thanking her lucky stars for making the sensible decision when booking the holiday all that time ago to sign up for the special, fully comprehensive insurance policy. Mrs. Horton-Jones, or Anne, as she had said Gina was to call her now, had explained it all. And, being a consumer rights solicitor, Gina knew right away that Anne meant business, as she sipped her tea and listened, while Gina told her all about Colin and his team-building away day. So, after a few phone calls, Gina, with Anne telling her what to say, had managed to get a refund on Colin's ticket and was going to use the unexpected windfall to have the time of her life, on her own, in her dream holiday destination, including an upgrade to a deluxe room with a sea view in the brand-new boutique Hotel Mirabelle that she was able to afford now she'd be travelling on her own. Anne had insisted on it, horrified on hearing that Gina had contemplated even for a second that she wasn't going on the holiday just because Colin couldn't or wouldn't. "Oh, no, dear, you mustn't let a little blip send you off course," Anne had told her. "You are a woman of substance. Come on, say it after me. I am a woman of substance. I will not be deterred. And I am perfectly capable of going on holiday by myself and having a jolly good time." Gina had felt a bit daft saying all that, especially when Anne had stood up into a power pose with fisted hands on hips, chanting the motivational mantra in a very loud Margaret Thatcher voice and motioning for Gina to do the same. But Gina had managed it and had been surprised to discover that she did actually feel stronger and a little bit more like her old self, the woman she had been in her late teens and early 20s, when she had had much more confidence and didn't take anywhere near as much crap as she did these days. Although Colin hadn't been impressed by her behaving oddly, as he'd said, when she had told him she was still going on the holiday, and she mooted the idea of them needing some time apart. But then, seemingly wanting to have the upper hand, he had swiftly followed it up with some odd behaviour of his own, saying, "I can't believe you're still going. It's like you don't even want to be married anymore if you're gallivanting like a single woman. Perhaps you want to leave me. Well, if that's what you really want, Gina, then it will be very selfish of me to stand in your way. Let's call it a trial separation, a chance for you to see if you can manage without me." And she had felt strangely calm at the prospect of doing just that. Now, as she walked down the aisle of the aeroplane looking for her seat, dragging a wheelie cabin bag behind her and struggling to stop it swerving at a right angle on account of one of the wheels being broken, Gina wondered if she should have shaved her legs, waxed her top lip, and flipped open the pop-up tent she kept in the garage to give herself an all-over spray tan inside it, like she would have done years ago, before her libido started ghosting her and she still liked having sex with Colin. Thinking of her now estranged husband, she wondered if he had spotted the note she'd left on the fridge yet. Gone to Greece. But on second thoughts, sod it. She couldn't be bothered with all that palaver, and besides, she had every intention of getting a real tan in the Greek sunshine as soon as she arrived, in about 4 hours' time. The rousing strum of the opening chords of Fernando were playing once again as the internal soundtrack to the exciting adventure she was going on. She was kaftan ready, hairy legs, top lip and all, and she could not wait for her holiday to begin. Chapter 2. The landing gear touched down, and Gina braced backwards in her seat to savour the thrilling sensation as the aeroplane rushed along the runway. Through the oval window to her left, The majestic rise of the granite mountains in the distance took her breath away, as did the creamy curve of sand and sparkling lapis blue sea, still rippling in the backdraft breeze from the aeroplane flying over the coastline, before the sharp descent needed to get a head start on making sure they didn't miss the end of the island's tiny runway and end up in the water. It had nearly happened the summer she turned 16, when the pilot left it too late and had to do a sudden ascent, circle several times, before attempting the landing again. Thankfully, she had brought them to a successful halt, amidst a spontaneous round of very relieved applause from all the passengers. Gina had often thought about that moment over the years, the way her mum, Shirley, had patted the top of her hand and calmly told her, "It'll be okay, love, and if it isn't, then at least we're together." Gina wished they were together now, with Shirley here by her side, excited and looking forward to all the things they used to love doing here on the island. She'd also wondered over the years what Shirley would have made of Colin, and knew deep down that she would have liked him in the beginning. He had seemed kind and caring when they first met, not long after Shirley had died from the breast cancer that had returned with a vengeance after a long remission. Gina had been at such a low ebb back then, having lost contact with her friends from art college after taking a break, and so she had been feeling lonely and like the spark had gone right out of her life. Then, after meeting Colin, he convinced her there was no need to go back to college, that the studying was too much for her so soon after losing her mum. Grief. Looking back, she knew that's what it was now. As an only child, she had always been very close to her mum. And then when she was a teenager, they had become even closer, more like best friends, sisters even. And so when Shirley died, the void had been unbearable at times, isolating and lonely. Meeting Colin had given her a lift, a proper boost. He had brought the laughter back into her life, and she had fallen in love with him fast, his smooth charm and desire for her hard to resist. Gina hadn't felt lonely or isolated anymore. Being with Colin had softened things. And then, when he proposed, and they got married a year or so later, she had felt secure again too. It had given her a sense of belonging. She was determined to make her marriage work, knowing the heartbreak of her own parents' marriage having fallen apart when she was a little girl. And she had loved getting married, with visions of creating a new family and having babies with her husband and living happily ever after. The whole fairy tale she had still believed in back then. But it hadn't worked out that way. Colin hadn't really been interested in having children, but reluctantly said they could try. Still, it never happened, and he wouldn't engage in pursuing fertility treatment. Gina often wondered too how different her life might have been if she had stayed at college and pursued her passion for painting and sketching. If she had ignored Colin when he had laughed that time, after she persuaded him to sit for a portrait to celebrate their wedding anniversary. She had been toying with the idea of taking up an art course again, but he hadn't liked the shape of his eyes or nose, ears, or, well, any of it to be precise. The canvas had ended up on the bonfire with "the rest of the rubbish," she had heard him muttering as he pushed it under his arm and pulled open the back door to go out into the garden. They had argued about it after she told him how hurtful his words had been to hear, and he had apologised and pacified her, saying it was just a joke, and that he had only been trying to help her by getting rid of it, because she seemed upset with the way the painting had turned out. And then the whole matter had been forgotten about. But deep down, Gina knew this was when the cracks in her marriage really set in, and they'd been mostly plastering over them ever since. Oh well, she had spent the best part of the last 4 hours or so of the flight with her headphones on, listening to music and thinking about the shambolic state of her marriage, and didn't want to dwell on it any longer and let thoughts of regret spoil her holiday. She couldn't turn back time, so what was the point of picking over it all? She had to look forward, because she had dreamed of this holiday and worked very hard for a very long time to pay for it. And so she was going to blooming well enjoy every second of the next fortnight. Smiling to herself, she took off her headphones and nodded, as if to underline her thoughts. An air steward made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, British Airways welcomes you to Kalosiros. The local time is 5:30 p.m, and the weather is a glorious 27 degrees. A collective ooh sound circulated the aircraft cabin. "Oh, thank goodness for that. I can't wait to get off and find a nice taverna to eat moussaka in and finish off with a small glass of that delicious Greek liqueur, mastica, an older woman with pink-framed glasses sitting next to Gina said, then quickly followed it with, "Sorry, did I say all that out loud?" Gina nodded politely at the woman. "I'm not sure I can handle another minute of my husband's complaining. You probably didn't hear him going on about it being too cold, too hot, too many people, not enough food, beer or whatever with your headphones on, which I have to say are a very good idea, and I wish I'd had the foresight to get myself a pair," she added in a covert voice. "It's been non-stop and the holiday hasn't even started properly yet." The woman rolled her eyes towards the man in the aisle seat, her husband presumably, and Gina smiled, unsure of what to say, but didn't need to respond as the woman carried on obliviously. "It's okay, he can't hear me. Deaf as a post, and he refuses to wear the hearing aids that we paid a fortune for, which is part of the problem as he gets frustrated, and then yells at me, convinced I'm doing it on purpose. Talking too quietly, that is." The woman shook her head in exasperation. "Are you travelling alone?" "Yes, my husband..." Gina paused before explaining. We're trialling a separation." The words felt funny, unfamiliar coming out of her mouth, and she wobbled momentarily, but quickly took a big breath and carried on talking. "Yes, he was supposed to be coming too, but couldn't make it in the end." Gina flicked her eyes downwards. It was all well and good her being a maverick, a woman of substance or whatever it was she had chanted with Anne in her drawing room that day. But she'd be lying if she didn't admit to feeling a bit weird as well, now that it was actually happening, and she was here, on the Greek island of Kalosiros, completely alone. She had looked around the aeroplane during the flight, and seen so many happy couples, the woman sitting next to her included, or so she had assumed, which was ironic, really, when the woman didn't sound happy at all. "That's a shame," the woman said, the tone of her voice sympathetic now. "How long are you here for?" 2 weeks. "Well, good for you for coming on your own. And if you want my advice, which you may not do, of course, but I have a feeling it may help you, just make the most of it, dear. There's been so many times over the years when I wish I'd had the courage to go it alone, but, well, I never did. And don't suppose I ever will now." The woman's eyes clouded with a sadness that made Gina want to step forward and give her an enormous hug. "Anyway, cheerio, and I hope you have a fabulous time." "Thank you. And I hope you find that nice taverna and enjoy your moussaka and mastica." Gina gave the woman a warm, kindly smile. "Oh, I will. And if you see a woman sitting on a beach all by herself, it will be me, having bumped off my husband so I can have a wonderful Shirley Valentine moment in peace." She laughed, but Gina spotted the fleeting glimmer of sorrow that passed across the woman's face. As she unbuckled her seatbelt, Gina closed her eyes momentarily, inhaled deeply, and smiled, as if to bank the giddy feeling of anticipation into her memory forever, just as she had as a teenager all those years ago on arriving here with her mum for their annual summer holiday. 2 whole weeks of sunshine and bliss. Time to potter along the harbour arm, mingling with the pelicans that roamed freely. Time to wander around the open-air market. Time to sit in the sun with her romance book without Colin coming out with his usual jibe about her wasting time reading such rubbish. Time to swim in the sea. Time to enjoy a long, lazy lunch with a glass of chilled wine. Time to just be, and to do whatever she pleased. What a treat. Although she'd be fooling herself to think she wasn't a little bit nervous about being here alone for 14 days. It was going to be a first for her, having never even lived on her own. Colin had moved into her house soon after they started dating, and then Pam too, a week after the wedding, supposedly on a temporary basis while she recovered from a hysterectomy, but then she never moved back out. Gina hadn't minded, though, as she felt sorry for Pam, who suffered with rheumatoid arthritis too, and so looked after her. It had reminded her of when she had looked after Shirley when she was ill. And Pam was fairly easygoing and kind enough when she wasn't complaining, although did have a tendency to think the sun shone out of her only child Colin's backside. But it did mean that Gina never had a moment to herself, apart from when she was out doing one of her cleaning jobs or helping out at the allotment. And even then, Colin would be messaging her with a variety of requests, usually along the lines of, "What's for dinner?" closely followed by, "When will you be home?" or his favourite, "Where are you?" Even though he could easily find out for himself by looking on the Life 360 app the 3 of them had installed on their phones. Not in a weird stalkerish way, but because there had been a special promo on the family bundle, and Colin loved nothing more than a bargain. So Gina, Colin and Pam now had their own family bubble, with a special button to press for emergency assistance. Like if they were ever taken hostage and couldn't use their voice to communicate, Colin had explained. Then, when she did get home, Pam was always ensconced in the big cuddle armchair by the window in the lounge, the one that Gina and Shirley used to sit in, as they shared a bucket of popcorn and watched a favourite film or TV series together. Grease, Pretty Woman, An Officer and a Gentleman, or old episodes of Bewitched were their go-to favourites for a full-on binge fest packed with romance, laughter, highs, lows, and lots of nostalgia. Gina had certainly never been on a holiday by herself before, not even a day trip or a spa day. She wasn't even sure if she liked her own company, but supposed now was as good a time as any to find out. As what better place to do so than on a gorgeous Greek island? Plus, with a bit of luck, the mobile signal on the island would be patchy, and she could give herself a digital detox, a proper break from Colin and his million messages a day habit. And yes, even though they had sort of agreed on a trial separation, Colin had continued contacting her for the entirety of the taxi ride to the airport with 23 unread messages, which Gina had seen on the screen when she'd switched off her phone as the aeroplane had been waiting on the runway, shortly before takeoff. Chapter 3. Gathering herself and the glossy magazine she had treated herself to at the airport, Gina stood up and politely waited for the woman with the pink glasses and her husband to leave, before moving into the aisle. After retrieving her wheelie cabin bag from the overhead locker, she slipped the magazine into the big, reusable bag for life that she was carrying in the crook of her elbow and made her way to the exit door. "Wow, this place looks incredible, and isn't the weather wonderful?" a woman with curly blonde hair styled into a chic, bouncy bob said to Gina as they moved down the mobile steps leading to the runway. As both women made it to the rustic, sun-bleached tarmac, the perimeter lined with tufty mounds of grass and wildflowers, they smiled at each other and adjusted the handles of their respective wheelie cabin bags. "It sure is," Gina replied shyly, not used to being noticed by a complete stranger, but liking it that two women had spoken to her now. And it briefly crossed her mind that they may not have talked to her if she had been travelling with Colin. People rarely did on the odd occasion they went out together. But then Colin could be a bit frosty with people he didn't know, often suspecting they had an ulterior motive or were out to take advantage. Like the time he'd been very offhand with a man on the next table, in a restaurant, when he had asked if they'd mind keeping an eye on his young daughter while he popped to the loo. Colin had then bemoaned the entire time that the guy had a flaming cheek expecting them to be unpaid babysitters, even though the girl had sat quietly reading a book for the 5 minutes or so that her dad wasn't there. Gina, on the other hand, had loved looking after the little girl, having a taste of what being a mum might have felt like, if only for a short while. Walking on, with the perfect blue sky and the gorgeous Greek air scented with jasmine, oregano, pine and sea salt, cocooning her like a cashmere blanket, Gina discreetly studied the woman who was in front of her now. She looked about the same age as Gina, and seemed to be travelling on her own too. But that's as far as the similarity went, as the other woman was impeccably dressed, stylish and fashionable in a very classic way, reminding Gina of Charlotte from Sex and the City. She was wearing a candy pink and white gingham full skirt with a wide belt, a sleeveless white blouse, cork-heeled wedge sandals, and a silk scarf tied at a jaunty angle around her neck. And she smelled divine too, a very expensive perfume. Gina gave her own crumpled cotton skirt and matching pink Primark t-shirt a surreptitious glance and made a mental note to shower off the musty travelling scent that was lingering on her body as soon as she got to the hotel. Admiring the chic, floppy straw hat the woman pulled from a designer tote bag looped over her arm and popped on her head, Gina made another mental note to see if she might find a similar hat for herself somewhere. And a tote bag too, so she could ditch the bloody awful big bag for life she'd had to bring on holiday after discovering, at the last minute, as she pulled the front door closed behind her and walked to the taxi waiting by the curb to take her to the airport, that the lovely-looking but cheap raffia beach bag she had bought especially for the holiday had a hole in the bottom. She had got all the way to the end of her front path before noticing the trail of bag paraphernalia scattered across the crazy paving slabs. She wondered if she might find what she was looking for here on the island, in the market near the harbour arm perhaps. Then she wondered too if the market was actually still here, and felt a bubble of anticipatory fizz at the prospect of exploring the island, retracing her teenage footsteps to find out. From memory, there had been a weekly market every Wednesday afternoon and into the evening when traditional Greek music would then play and street food would be served. White canopied stalls sold fresh fruit and vegetables, fish from the sea lapping mere metres away, and freshly baked bread too. Plus, handcrafted traditional pottery and plates, trinkets, and occasional items for travellers like her who had forgotten to bring the essentials, a sun hat and Factor 50 sun cream, she realised, as her pale, freckly skin was already beginning to prickle in the heat. The Charlotte-starred woman with the sun hat put a pair of designer shades on too and headed towards the ramshackle hut where a group of handsome, tanned and toned Greek men in uniforms were smiling and checking passports with a cursory, laid-back glance, before ushering everyone towards the luggage retrieval area inside the small, single-storied, whitewashed airport building. Having managed to pack all her clothes inside the wheelie cabin bag, Gina didn't have very many summer dresses and just a couple of bikinis with matching wraps and a kaftan in any case. She left the airport and went straight to a waiting queue of taxis to find one to take her to the hotel. 20 minutes of very narrow, winding, rustic cliffside roads with hairpin bends driven at breakneck speeds later, and the taxi came to a halt at the end of a long driveway on the top of a hill. She paid the driver and waved goodbye with a cheery but very relieved "Efkaristo" in thanks as she took a deep breath and willed her racing heart to slow to a more normal rhythm. Smoothing down her crumpled skirt and tidying her curls into place, she exhaled and adopted a serene smile to create how she imagined a breezy, chic, well-travelled woman would present, and pulled her cabin bag towards the honey-coloured converted farmhouse nestling among vineyards, citrus and olive trees. The setting was stunning and looked even better in real life than it had in the online luxury travel brochure Anne had popped up on the laptop screen during that phone call to get the refund on Colin's ticket and give her holiday the ultimate glow-up. "Welcome to the Hotel Mirabelle." A man in jeans and a white polo shirt with the hotel's logo on opened the glass and brass-furnished entrance door and took her suitcase in one swift, effortless movement. "Thank you." Gina followed him to the reception desk, the cool, citrus-scented air-conditioned breeze refreshing on her hot body that had chosen this precise moment to flare up like a flaming bushfire. Typical. Grabbing a crumpled-up tissue from her bag for life, Gina swiftly used it to dab at the beads of sweat she could feel forming on her top lip. The man parked a suitcase by the reception desk, where an exceedingly attractive bearded guy with curly hair the colour of chestnuts glossed in sunshine and matching melting brown eyes took over. "Hello, I am Christos, and welcome. May I have your name, please?" he asked with a sexy Greek accent, locking eye contact and holding it for a second or two longer than necessary, smiling, warmly, charismatically, intimately almost, as if she were the only woman in the world. And it felt unnerving, but mingled with a thread of thrill too. It sounded daft, but Gina swore she could feel a sort of awakening, something inside her like a switch flicking back on, and she wasn't complaining about it. It felt good to be seen by a very hot man and not feel as invisible as she often did when minding her own business back home in England.